I'd first like to welcome and introduce Ray, who is probably well known to the room, Ray Kaspiew. My pleasure to introduce the second panel discussion on the conference, How Early Intervention Can Change the Trajectory for Individuals, Families at Risk of Family Violence, and will be chaired by Ray, Research Director, Services and Systems, Australian Institute of Family Studies. Ray is a socio-legal researcher and has been involved in an extensive range of studies on separated families, including a focus on the wellbeing of children, children's participation in family law proceedings, and the impact of family violence on parenting. I'd also like to invite our other four panellists to the stage: Judge Alexandra Harland, Federal Circuit and Family Court of Australia, and a board member of FRSA. Bevan, CEO, Full Stop Australia. Phillip, CEO, No to Family Violence. Allison, Wainwright, CEO of Family Life. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ray and our four distinguished panellists.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you to FRSA for the kind invitation to chair this panel. I'm always delighted to support FRSA activities because FRSA members always support the research activities that we undertake at the Australian Institute of Family Studies, including most recently the research that has supported the review of the FRSP program that you heard the Attorney-General speak of this morning, that's being undertaken by Mr Andrew Metcalf AO. I also want to acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woi people of the Kulin Nation, whose lands we're on today, and I pay respects to elders past and present, and I acknowledge and pay respects to any First Nations people in the room. We are on an area that is extremely significant to the Wurundjeri Woi, and I'd encourage you to take a walk in the park. There's a scar tree down there that really shows the very long and significant history of this area here. So we're talking today about how early intervention can change the trajectory for individuals and families at risk of family violence. We have an extremely expert and esteemed panel who will address the issues from different perspectives, their particular practice perspectives. Before we embark on the conversation, I just want to reiterate some key data points to frame the discussion up. So last year, the Australian Child Maltreatment Study was released, showing that 40% of children had been exposed to family and domestic violence, really as direct victims. And the prevalence of other forms of abuse ranges from 32% for physical abuse to 8.9% for neglect. Looking at the adult population, the Personal Safety Survey tells us that 35% of women have experienced physical violence or sexual violence from a person known to them since the age of 15. Looking at separated families, the group that many of you are very concerned with, AFE's research, the Experiences of Separated Families study, shows that 60% of separated parents in our survey reported experiencing physical hurt prior to separation, physical hurt or emotional abuse prior to separation. And around 60% of those indicated that the children had also been directly exposed to that behaviour. 2022-23, we have one woman killed on average every 11 days by an intimate partner. The figures for First Nations women who are counted and in the figures, and I take note of the observations that Tanya made this morning about not the data not being comprehensive. So First Nations women, the figure is 6 times that. And of course, we've recently had a spike in intimate partner violence deaths, and, you know, we've had crisis talks convened in Canberra. So this is an incredibly significant issue. And it's, you know, my great privilege to chair this panel and to invite each of the panellists in turn to introduce themselves and to give you a flavour of how they engage with early intervention and families experiencing violence in a response context before we embark on a more interactive discussion. Allison, I'll turn to you first. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray, and good morning, everyone. As indicated, my name is Allison Wainwright. I'm the CEO of an organisation called Family Life here in Melbourne, and of course, I'm proudly serving on the FRSA board as well. And our organisation provides a broad suite of responses to family violence, as well as in early intervention supports to children and young people impacted by a range of adverse experiences, including the experience of violence. And we also provide a large support package to women, both therapeutically and from a counselling perspective. And we're one of the largest service providers for people who use violence, and that looks like a broad suite of responses. So when I got the invitation to come along today and talk about early intervention, my first reflection was how clearly the issue of responding to violence fell within that concept of a wicked problem. And wicked problems, as we all know, are those problems that don't have one simple solution to them. And when I think about wicked problems, I always think and lean into the work of my colleagues in the US, Mark Kramer and John Carnier, who write about the water systems change. And really what they say in summary, it's a great article if you want to go and do some reading, but really what they say in summary is that when you want to change a wicked problem, you have to change the way you think about the problem. So just this morning, we heard the comment that when crises emerge, what happens is you get a lot of resourcing, and resourcing is very good. Absolutely embrace and need more resourcing. But often where the change stays is at the resourcing, policy and procedure level. And what you don't see is the shift of the mental model behind the work that you do. So when I think about early intervention, and I want to pick up your point, Ray, I think there's some things that we need to think about in the context of early intervention around family violence. The first is your point around the new data, or newish data, that has really shocked the sector to its core around the Australian maltreatment study. That really shows what we have here in Australia is a crisis of childhood. And I had written all the data down that you shared, so you beat me to that. But I think we should all be reflecting on that data and thinking about what it's really like to be a child living in Australia, and challenge ourselves that our children are in a large part not having the experience we would want them to have. And then we think about all the data that shows us from a neurobiological perspective around the impact of that on children's brains. The second point I want to make is that the childhood crisis we are experiencing in Australia is not separate from the family violence crisis we are experiencing. These two are intrinsically linked and they have the same basis, and what we have is people in our community who are deeply traumatised, who have complex presentations, and much of that is stemming from their early childhood experiences. And so the third point I want to make around shifting our mental model, which I think is critical around early intervention, is we have to collectively grapple with this very hard concept that has come to the fore in our practice, that people can use violence, they can be perpetrators. I don't like the term, I like to talk about people who use violence, but they can be people who use violence, and many of them may be victims of violence at some point in their childhood. And that's really hard to grapple with. It's really hard to hold those two concepts in mind. But I invite you to think about the experience of Australian children and how that spans up through the life course of individuals. So I don't want to take up too much time, but I think when we think about early intervention, Ray, I think about a life course model. I think about holding complexity. I think about how we can identify those critical points where we can change the life of individuals and their families and really bring about long-lasting change.
Thanks very much, Alison. very useful insights there, and I'm sure we'll have the opportunity to explore them further this morning. I now want to turn to Karen Bevan and invite Karen to introduce herself and explain how she engages with this topic.
Hi everyone. I'm the CEO of Full Stop Australia. We're an organisation that does work across domestic, family and sexual violence. Nationally, we run a program, a helpline called 1800 Full Stop. It's philanthropically funded, and we work across all forms of violence there. We also run helplines in New South Wales and the New South Wales Sexual Violence Helpline, which has been funded this year for its 50th year. I think when the women who started what became the Sydney Rape Crisis Centre 50 years ago, when they started that, they never thought we'd still be responding to rape crisis 50 years later, and yet here we are, friends. So we work across the crisis response, but actually what we do is so much more than that. Through our phone lines in New South Wales and nationally, including our Redress National phone line, which is 24 hours, our Rainbow line, which is a front door for LGBTIQ plus communities, what we do is we connect people immediately with a trauma specialist counsellor. That's so important. You know, when we talk about earlier intervention, we need to make sure that when people reach out, that we meet them with what they need then, which is so often a moment of acknowledgement, hearing, and safety. So we deliver those services, but that's not all we do. We're also working very much in the world of education and change. So we have, since our phenomenal sisters started us 50 years ago, we have always had a focus on transforming the community and the workforce that come into contact with people who've been subject to sexual, domestic and family violence. So we deliver training around complex trauma, crisis response, ethical interventions, ethical leadership, bystander. We work with companies around sexual harassment, all of those things that are part of the bigger picture around what we tolerate around sexual, domestic and family violence in this country. The third aspect of our work, and the one that's made me probably a little bit bleary this morning, is advocacy. We're advocates nationally and we work across many state jurisdictions for law reform, policy and resource allocation that will end gender-based violence and create a safer world for everyone. So our organisation has both very specific work in its service delivery and very broad work across our advocacy and education. I was so delighted to be part of this panel because I think the linkages between those of us who have particularly specialist sexual violence capability and services that are delivered in the FRS sector, we really need to be talking to each other and connecting. So much of what's happening for people who seek support and are subject to sexual, domestic and family violence is siloed, and yet their experiences aren't siloed. Their experiences are happening right now, but there's a little bit of service here, a little bit of response there. And so really, we're really keen to talk to people about how do we make sure that we're linking well across those services. We also really, a key kind of area for me is talking to the sector about sexual violence in particular. We know that we can intervene so much more effectively when we understand the broader context. And what we know is this: sexual violence is a significant part of domestic and family violence. We know that it's underreported. We know that we kind of skim over it and say domestic violence includes financial abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, and we skip over sexual violence. Sexual violence is a absolutely critical part, and the intersection of sexual and domestic violence is something that when we understand that better, we can intervene earlier and respond more effectively. The other piece of that we're very, we think is a really important and rich conversation, and just personally, I've worked often with the FRS sector over more than 30 years, and so I know this is work that you are passionate about too, and that is the way that child sexual abuse and violence against children, and I just could not support your comments more, Alison, but we know that the intersection of child sexual abuse and domestic and family violence is an absolutely critical issue. And the more that we can respond in a trauma-informed and a way that enables conversation about sexual violence to happen, can make sure that in all our responses, whether it's the counselling response, the community response, the parenting planning, the family law response, if we can actually uncover the complexity of what's happening around sexual violence in families where there is domestic family and sexual violence, we can respond to children so much better. We can reduce harm. We can absolutely improve the support for non-offending parents, and we can create better trajectories out of the impact and that long-term response that Tanya mentioned earlier, that is the critical piece, crisis response, but what happens next? When we think about response and recovery, when we uncover, when we address sexual violence earlier in the trajectory in domestic and family violence, we can actually contribute to more effective response and recovery. So thank you so much. It's such a delight to be here.
Thank you, Karen. Points there that we will come back to. So I'd like to now invite Phillip Ripper from No to Violence to introduce himself and the context in which he engages with this topic.
Thank you for having me. This is my first time at an FRSA conference, and what an amazing event it's turning out to be. For people who aren't familiar with No to Violence, we are one of the national peak bodies representing organisations that work with people who use violence, men who use family violence in particular, and organisations and professionals who work with them. We have three main functions. One is that peak body role of policy, advocacy, research. The second is we provide the national front door to services. So like colleagues here, we operate the 24/7 men's referral service, which is a single session counselling and referral service for men who are concerned about their behaviour and their use of violence. We offer a range of supplementary and complementary services as well, which I can go into a little bit of detail, but I don't want to take too much time, but innovative service responses like a brief intervention service that is available now to men in prison, in one prison at least in Risdon, and short-term structured counselling for men who use violence and have been excluded from the home. So rather than requiring women and children to jump in the back of a car and flee, our men's accommodation and counselling service will support those men into emergency accommodation, a motel, on the understanding and the commitment of those men to engage in a structured course of counselling over a course of a month. So, that is an innovative service that was stood up through COVID, and the Victorian Government has continued to support, and we think is a model that should be applied nationally. The third function of the organisation is workforce development and building the capacity of the service system to respond to men's use of family violence. So that's a bit about the organisation. In terms of where we sit in the landscape, our mission is about shifting the burden, and I want to echo Allison's points about the wicked problem that is family and domestic violence in this country. And I often think of that quote, you won't solve the problem using the same thinking that created it. And I think, you follow the public discourse over the last couple of weeks and you see a heck of a lot of that. The public discourse to say, this is a crisis, we need to do more. And what do we go to? We go to the same old tried and trusted mechanisms. more police, bail reform, better courts, more of the same. And when you look at what we're currently doing, we are just scratching the tip of the iceberg here. I think Tanya described that incredibly well about the focus of the family violence sector at the very pointy end, the thing that captures the public imagination, that frames the debate in this country is the murder of women by their partners, and that is disgraceful, and it should and must be in focus. But don't ever forget that is just the tip. 18% of family violence is reported to police, 18%. And our system, even in Victoria where the government has put billions of dollars in, still cannot keep up with that bit of the iceberg that's poking up above the water, the bit that's being reported. 82% not being reported. This is the vast bulk of family violence. This is where our 40% of children are growing up. These are the homes where mum and the kids are walking on eggshells, where they're looking, how's things going at home? Do I need to be worried? Do I need to find space in my room? Who's going to take the heat tonight? That family violence that's not being reported, it's not coming to the attention of police, it's not ending up on the front page of the paper, but that is in tens of thousands of households every night, and tonight will be no different. And yet we keep focusing on the tip, and we keep excusing and accommodating and allowing that vast bulk of family violence to continue being perpetrated. So, swinging back to the purpose of No to Violence, our mission is about shifting the burden, because everything you've heard today, and probably over days and days and weeks and months and years of discourse for the last 50 years since women's refuge were created, the predominant response is how do we support women to flee, to escape, to heal, to recover, and that's really, really important, but it's only half of the issue. And while we continue only to have that debate, we're letting men off the hook, we're letting the burden sit with women and children across Australia, and we're letting men go unaccountable for their use of violence and their behaviour. And it's just not right. It says to the community, it says to men, we accept men's violence as a given. That's what it says. It says, we accept that men will be violent. We accept that men will use family violence. And all of us, the rest of the sector, the rest of the community, have to accommodate that. So we need better recovery, better refuges, we need better escape, we need better police, we need better intervention orders, we need stronger bail. But it says we accept men's use of violence as an inevitable. And so part of No to Violence's mission is about trying to reshape the public discourse to look at the issue, the wicked problem of family violence through a different lens, through a more complex lens that says, yes, we need to work to make sure every woman and child is safe every night. And we need to do that by really focusing attention on what is driving men's use of violence. Who are these men who use violence? What are their pathways into violence? What are the interventions that work to interrupt and disrupt men's use of violence? And what are the pathways out of using violence? So that's a little bit about No to Violence, where we see ourselves in the architecture and the landscape of the system, and a bit about how we would like to shape the public discourse.
Thank you very much, Phil. We've heard three quite varied sets of perspectives and experiences in the way that our first three speakers interact with the question of family, domestic and sexual violence. And our fourth speaker, Judge Harland from the Federal Circuit and Family Court of Australia, brings yet another perspective to bear, a particularly interesting one in my view as a socio-legal scholar. So Judge Harland,
Thank you.
over to you.
I've been a judge now for 11 years and I've seen a change in the kinds of cases that come before us. And, you know, I can say that the majority of cases that I hear have allegations of family violence, and the majority of cases I hear have multiple risk factors. And whilst on the one hand, when we're talking about early intervention, I'm at the other end of the spectrum, I do see the benefits of the early intervention, and I can't point to hard and fast facts about it, but I can say from my observations that I have seen a change in the expert reports. There are a greater number of expert reports calling out the risk and being blunt about it. So, staying when there's lethality factors and saying that at an early stage, and that can be really beneficial in terms of if that's something that's highlighted early, it may well be that that's a no-time case and that there is no safe way for there to be a relationship. And certainly that might be an issue that needs to be tested at trial before looking at any sort of time. I think, assuming that supervised time is always appropriate and safe is not the case. And I think what I can also see from the intervention services is I can tell when someone's appearing before me who's been supported in being able to understand their experiences and start to see the violence for what it is and that they're not responsible for that, but they're dealing with the consequences of it. And I think when you can see someone who is able to say, actually, you can't tell me what my experience is, only I can say that, that's really powerful. And that's something that is coming through more, which I think is due to many of the services that you provide, because family law is unique in that sense, in that there are so many, for families, they have so many issues that are beyond legal, and family lawyers can help when these families are getting the other supports that they need that range from the practical, from housing to finance, but also that sort of your psychological and mental health supports. And, I think in some instances, lawyers, particularly when they're cross-examining about family violence, some still have a lot to learn, I think. I spend a lot of time intervening, referring to ANRO's research and just sort of challenging some of the assumptions that are made about family violence, such as, there is no perfect victim because there's no perfect human. People can have a range of reactions to different things, and people can, lash out and still be the person who doesn't have the power, who has experienced trauma and is still experiencing trauma. And I also don't think you can separate that violent behaviour and go, oh, but he's still a good dad, is he? Is he? There's got to be some deficits there. And, one of the things that, I'm always thinking of too is the role modelling. What role modelling is it providing if we say that's okay, And, of course, it can be complex, it can be difficult. Not all cases are clear-cut, but I do think that the services that you provide are really, really vital to that, because it's also not uncommon, say, for someone not to be able to talk about what they've experienced straight away and to not have trust to talk about it straight away, to be, there's still a lot of myths around that, if I don't offer time, are my kids going to be taken away? Sometimes the protective thing is to say, it's not safe. It's not safe for me, it's not safe for the kids. The men's services also have a really important role in trying to get men to acknowledge their behaviour. And some do and some don't. And I can tell which ones who have used services and know the language to use, they use the right words, but I can tell it doesn't mean anything to them, they're playing the game. So, with some, if there's not that insight and that change, then that risk is still really high. And I think also it's really important to be constantly focusing back on the person who's responsible for the violence and their behaviour and focusing a spotlight on them. and not the spotlight on the other parent, which has been the tendency, because, realistically, I expect her to be traumatised. I expect that there's going to be some compromises there. Of course there is. So what can we do to make it what scaffolding can we have for her? And that might mean, even if the person using violence has changed and has some insight, she might not be ready. And, who's providing for the kids? What's going to be the safest thing for them, short term and long term, I think. And I think one area where we really need to do a lot more work is with respect to children's rights. I don't think we listen to kids very well. I think we still tend to think, we need to protect kids from the conflict and the proceedings. And let's get real. Kids are on the internet and they're not dumb. They know what's going on. And I think they also, how anxiety-provoking is it if people don't tell you what's going on? You know it because you can sense it. I can see it in the courtroom when it's visceral, the distrust, hate and anger between people. And you can't tell me that kids aren't acutely aware of that. But we still too often have this sense of, we're protecting them by shielding them. First of all, we're not shielding them at all. We're actually making it more anxious for them because we're not giving them information. And I think we've got to really sort of change that and look at how can we make it safe for kids to express their views. And I think particularly where they have been traumatised and where there's family violence, I think it's even more important that we be listening to kids, including little kids. I don't think there should be an age on, every child has the right to be heard about matters that affect them. Every child. They might not have capacity, that's a different issue, but they have that right. And I've been fortunate to be on the Family Law Council where we've spoken a lot with stakeholders about these different issues, and being on the FRSA board also lets me find out a lot more about the services that you're providing, because often the interaction I have is with the services at the court, who are also fantastic. But I want to say that I think the work that you do is really important, and I can see that filtering through. So you might think it's not noticed or understood, but it is, and I think it's really, really important, and it does make a difference. It makes, I think, particularly women feel better able to assert themselves and express themselves when they are having to go to court, which is often, a couple of years down the track when they've been through intervention orders and other proceedings. So that sort of scaffolding support that you provide is vital.
Thank you very much, Judge Harland. Very illuminating comments there. I want to pick up your point about making a difference, but particularly in the context of averting men and boys who might be on a violence trajectory, averting them from that trajectory in an early intervention context. I'm sure that all panellists have thoughts about this, but I might turn first to Allison to share your views on designing services that might provide an early intervention platform for men and boys.
Thank you, Ray. And just thank you, so many good points from our fellow panellists that I was just nodding along to. And I want to connect up to something Tanya spoke about. Our organisation and myself professionally have, had the privilege of being part of the family violence reform in Victoria from the beginning. And I think despite all the work, and we have much to celebrate in Victoria, we have to still acknowledge that much of our work is still siloed. We have not moved to that point where we really think about how people live. What do families really look like? What do relationships really look like? And we're always grateful for funding, but remember our funding comes with targets, and our targets have cohorts attached to them. So we get funded, I think of our organisation, to work with women, women and children and parenting and men and boys, but of course those are artificial divides because people live in integrated, messy, wonderful relationship attachment networks. And so really one of the big challenges, I think, and I'll talk shortly about boys and men particularly, but I think this is relevant as one of those game changer mental model pieces for us, is we have to move from siloed, shallow, short-term models of intervention to long-term, integrated, deep, complex pieces of work. And that requires us to shift the way we do intake, the way we engage with people, the way we organise our services, and the long-term commitment we put into the work we do with vulnerable people who, as we have heard from the data, are really starting on the back foot from the very beginning because of their childhood experiences. Throughout my career, I've had I think joy, but also, I suppose, the exposure of working in most parts of the system. I started my experience in another country in child protection. I've done child protection, family support, family violence, really been able to see the whole lens of the world. And what always strikes me is we're actually talking about the same people. We're talking about the same people who are struggling for a whole range of reasons. And if I go back to the data that we talk about in the childhood maltreatment study, not only was that data shocking, it also gave us some clues around the gendered experience for both girls and boys through their childhood and what it meant for them. How did that actually impact on them longer term? And there's some important clues there, I think, around how we need to begin to shape responses. So I always think, I hate the word golden thread because it's rather tarnished and there's not much golden about it, but there is certainly a thread if I think about young boys. Those young boys, you know, our family service workers go out or family violence workers go out, those young boys that Phillip's talking about who are also experiencing family violence in the home from dad who are pretty terrified. They land up in child protection, they land up in family support if they're lucky, and they don't land up in child protection. They land up in the youth justice system. They're struggling at school, so we pick them up in that space. They're in YJ, and then there's this awful trajectory that just builds momentum for this young person. And one day they land up in one of our programs, and they're a man using violence. And of course, it's very challenging at times to have empathy for people who use violence. And I want to be very clear. We know what the research tells us. Not all people who use violence they're not cohesive. There are many categories, and there are some people who do not fall into this category, and that's pretty clear. I'm really talking about those men and young men who have significant disorganised attachment relationships, who've had disorganised, chaotic early lives, and present with a broad range of complexity around them. And you can't help but have some empathy for those boys, even when you obviously have no support for the behaviour they are choosing. So let's work backwards. How do we actually change that? How do we make sure that boy doesn't become that man who doesn't land up in your court, judge, and doesn't cause the damage to his family that he doesn't often want to, but is just really, making very, very poor choices along with a whole lot of other complexity. And I think we need to work backwards and think about what are the opportunities for trauma-informed visibility. Even in our Victorian reform, we have not nailed visibility. We don't see risk. We can't respond to risk. We have to figure out how to engage men and boys in the conversation. And I'm not talking about prevention. There are expert colleagues in the room and in the sector who talk about prevention. I'm talking about engaging men who are already using violence. Because right now, even the way we engage with them, whether it be on the phone or in our first contact, it's not our best work, if I'm honest. And I talk about that even from our own organisation. We're on a journey around improving that. It has to be, what are your risks, what are your needs, how do we help you, and how do we manage that? And we have to think about trauma recovery in that space. I think this is already quite apparent in the work with adolescents using violence in the home, but I think we need to think about that from the earliest encounter all the way up to the most tertiary point where these men are coming through the door. And until we engage with that, there is no silver bullet here, Ray. We've got to actually embrace the complexity of this work and really begin to deeply invest in deep innovation that accepts this is a complex cohort, there are overlying issues, and you can't deal with one part of it. So I don't have an easy answer, but I think we need to start a movement for change, and we need to start talking about what will it take to bring those systems together, and how do we actually build the knowledge base to do that.
Thank you very much, Alison. There's a lot in that. Many things to think about and expand upon. But I'd just like to continue this theme a little bit with hearing from Phil. You referred to understanding what is driving men's use of violence and understanding pathways in and out of violence. I'd like to invite you to expand on that. Do we have enough evidence about that? Do we have enough knowledge? If you're speaking from a practice base, what are your hypotheses?
So in order, no, and no.
That's it then.
No, I want to echo a lot of what Alison said, that if you follow the discourse around men who use violence and family violence, you would come to think that there was a category called men who use violence and that it was meaningful. And it's completely meaningless. The diversity of the experience of men and the diversity and experience of men who use violence is incredibly complex, and we would never seek to address any other complex social issue by lumping everyone into one bucket. And we are deeply unsophisticated. We are absolutely in the infancy of starting to understand who are people who use violence, what motivates them, what needs are being met through their use of violence, what alternatives are there. And that's before you even get to the point of saying, so let's build an evidence base of practice that's going to intervene. Again, if you follow the public discourse, we have organisations, many who probably represented here today, who run programs like men's behaviour change programs, and there's a lot of great clinicians who have spent a lot of time and energy developing what they think are, really important interventions for men who use violence. But our model is essentially sort of one size fits all, a group program, and we'll intervene over 10 or 20 weeks, and and then we'll sort of say, oh, hopefully you're fixed. No other, it's completely naive, no other sector would you aim to change, provide a therapeutic intervention through that sort of modality and expect a result that was going to change people's lives profoundly. The factors that drive people into using violence are interconnected, mutually supporting, driving, systems and attitudes and beliefs. You picture yourself as being that boy who's growing up in that house where there's misogyny and violence and disrespect of women, and that's your lived experience every day. And then you go to school, and in Year 9 you do a little course on respectful relationships, and you come home again to that. That respectful relationship course, brilliant, great, do it. That fully support that. But that's not engaging with the complexity of that young boy's life, and it's not. And how we expect that to deliver a result and change a child's trajectory, it's bonkers. So the no is, we know next to nothing about the complexity of what drives people into using violence, and we know even less about interventions that can change that course for so many people at different points in their life. And we know even less about the effectiveness of those programs. So, we need to start having that conversation about putting the use of violence at the centre of the debate and really shifting the focus to say, who are these people, what works, and how do we provide different pathways? And it is incredibly complex because we know so much about early childhood development, whether it's first 1,000 days and neurobiology of trauma responses, right through to attachment styles, right through to how people internalise their role in families and their gender roles. These are incredibly complex, and they all interplay with family violence. And again, our ask is to bring more sophistication and focus on the heart of that problem, because it's not just everyone in this room who's dealing with the outcomes and the implications of family violence. 83% of our family court, family violence. 80% of our family support, child protection system, family violence. Our mental health system is really a family violence system. Our AOD services are really family violence services. All of these programs and services that so many of us in this room provide really are driven by family violence, but they're not identified as family violence systems. They're not identified as family violence responses, but that is what's at the heart of so much of the work in the social and community service space, let alone the 50% of police, frontline policing, which is family violence. So, we're seeing the impact of family violence all over our community, but we're not seeing it for what it is because we're hiding it under the guise of these silos. And I think Allison's point could not be made any better. We silo up bits of people's experience. We provide a program, an intervention, a service, an outcome, get a bit of funding, process someone through that little bit of their human experience and expect it to change the world. People live in complex, messy lives, in families, in relationships, in community, and we've got to take, Allison said it better than I ever will, deeper, more holistic, more comprehensive understanding of people's lived experience. And I think that's the challenge for everyone in this room, is through our practice, we can do that work in a way that governments never will. So, my challenge to everyone here is to start thinking, don't wait for anyone else. We are the change we need to see in the world. We are the people we've been waiting for. In your practice, start thinking about how you can free up some of those dollars, some of those program guidelines, how you can be more creative, seek forgiveness, not permission from your funders. Go and be bold and innovate.
Thanks, Phil. I think there is something that demands to be unpacked further, and that is the complexity of family, domestic and sexual violence. And I'd like to invite Karen to start that journey.
Gee, thanks.
In this conversation.
I think, this is one of the things that really strikes us because we come into the work through, in some ways, our long history in sexual violence, and we come into the work with domestic and family violence through that lens. And what that has given us in our thinking is that sort of complexity of the intersections that we're facing here. And I'm just going to note that the words rape and sexual assault hit hard in a particular way, and they hit differently. So I just want to kind of note that because I'm going to use a little bit of a story. So I'd just like to give you that little bit of moment to breathe, because for some of us, these words really hit hard. I was talking to a colleague recently who had been working with police in an unnamed jurisdiction, and we sometimes provide input around sex crimes matters. And a young man, police were working out whether to proceed with charges against a young man. He was under 20, and there were 5 complainants in relation to sexual assault matters, including rape, in relation to him. And it was a complex group, but with all of those young women were struggling. And so the issues around what happens going forward with those criminal proceedings. The conversation I had with my colleague was, here's a young man, not even 20, there's 5 sexual assault victims. Whether or not this matter goes to court is one thing. Imagine 5 of those young women spoke up. Only about 8% of victim survivors speak up. Were even report in the first place. So, they're part of the 1.5%, heading down that route, or that part of the 8% that might be the 1.5% where there's conviction. The reason this matters is because if there's not accountability for that young man, he will go on to partner and repartner. He's already partnered in some form of sexual manner and possibly intimate partner manner, family manner, a relationship with young women. He's going to go on and partner and repartner. And that's going to show up later. Now, what that means in family relationship services is that somewhere along the line, perhaps a young woman in a relationship with this man comes to you and she's going to talk about, the use of maybe coercion, maybe there's financial abuse. But if we don't ask the right questions to uncover complexity of that violence and the fact that includes sexual violence, and maybe it's been sexual violence that has manifested in lots of ways that we know are contributors to lethality, for example, the use of non-fatal strangulation. If we don't actually ask the right questions to find out if that's occurring, we can't respond in a way that both actually effectively addresses the deep and very significant trauma of sexual assault, the trauma of rape, then our family violence intervention is likely to be less effective. So I guess that's, just a little walk into the complexity that we are actually seeing this show up in so many ways. And we also know through our helpline services, a really significant proportion of the work our trauma specialist counsellors do, like you ring us, that's who you get, there's no one in the middle to answer that call, are people who are carrying significant lifelong trauma from rape and sexual assault experience, both as children but also early in relationships. And we're like the service that they use between getting access to other things. Those women have been in multiple relationships and they have often been victimised over and over and over again. So the complexity of family violence is that many of the people in those relationships have complex webs of personal experience of trauma, but if we never ask about sexual violence, we can't address it well.
Thank you, Karen. That's an utterly compelling example, really compelling. We have about 10 minutes left in the conversation, and I think it's probably time to allow the audience to ask questions. I've asked enough. Who would like to kick off? I'm sure you've all got many thoughts.
Thanks, Ray. Hi, everyone. Thanks to the panel too for your comments. I guess a question really arises from what Allison and Phillip have spoken a bit about, but also what Sarah Decrea mentioned yesterday from the floor. My name's Chris. I'm from Emerging Minds. We're based in Adelaide. I'm thinking a bit about many families in our communities that, for whom, like, the police are not a safe place, not a safe site. For whom the criminal justice system is not a safe site either. For whom even our services aren't, safe sites in terms of responding to family violence. And so I'm thinking of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families, families from culturally diverse backgrounds, gender diverse families, gender expansive families, And also what Alison said in terms of, this idea of wicked problems, how we think about that makes a difference to the options that are available to us in terms of responding. So I've been thinking a bit about how even the term early intervention, if we think about just that term, whether that closes off options for us, right? What I'm thinking about then is, there are many communities for whom those other things aren't safe sites who are finding ways to intervene early in family violence, for families in their communities, aren't there? That we never hear about, really. That just stay within those communities. So much knowledge, so many skills about keeping women and kids safe, responding to men. And so I guess what I'm interested in really is what can we be doing about that? How can we be elevating those very local, particular community responses? Finding ways to document them so that they reach the status of research, and so they can be more widely circulated, so others can learn from them, so they can build on them as such. So I mention all of that. My question really is to all of you in relation to what possibilities or options are there for your services or services that are part of your peak bodies or that you work with, do you think, that can contribute to this circulation of these early interventions that perhaps don't meet a more strict criteria around early intervention? I'm just wondering, do my comments prompt any anything for you in relation to that?
So,
Just say one of the most, fantastic early intervention strategies that every single one of us and all our communities have is we can start by believing women, and that across, rape, sexual assault, domestic and family violence. And actually that's often how communities respond effectively, because they start from a place of belief. So, really, I think when people are met with acknowledgement, belief. None of us have to be CSI Miami. We don't need to be the police. We don't need to decide on the balance of probabilities. We don't even need to decide on the, without reasonable doubt. We can actually start by believing women and what we hear, and believing children. And what we hear is that immediate intervention by a family member, a service provider, is the first step to genuine early intervention.
thank you, Karen. And I can see that Alison and then Phil and probably Judge Harland are all desperate to have a go at that question as well. So, Alison.
I'll try and be quick.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. It was a great question. I think you called on a number of things. We know from great work, Emerging Minds, who do great work, many people in the room do great work with children who've experienced trauma, that trauma becomes a barrier to access systems because systems can feel unsafe. So once again, let's talk about young boys and girls who've experienced childhood trauma and had experiences with police coming into the home and going to court and all those awful experiences. And then we say to those young boys and young girls, I'm just focusing on my work with young boys here, when you start to struggle, when you don't know how to cope in that 15, 16, you've got a girlfriend, things are going wrong, and you don't feel good about it, where do you go? What part of the system? He's not going to go to the police and say, I think I'm going to commit a crime against my partner. He doesn't have anywhere to go currently to say, please help me. That's not going to be picked up in respectful relationships, potentially, but knowing how that service is delivered. So I think there's something about how our system organises ourselves, how we brand our services, how we make ourselves accessible to boys and girls who have a trauma background. I do agree with Philip's comment earlier. Absolutely, we don't have the knowledge and the experience that we have in the men's behavioural change space. But I want to appeal to everyone in the room. We know how to work with complexity, and there is knowledge that can be transferred across the space. We understand the impact of trauma on the brain. We understand what it looks like in the childhood trauma space. We have much knowledge around responding to post-traumatic stress disorders in adults through our work with veterans and others. We know what that work looks like. And we have a lot of skill around attachment repair work, and we need to bring that work into the work. We are not powerless. We need to change our mental model and see that this is critical skills. We have staff who are good at boundaried work with people who are complex, and we can change that behaviour. And just last point, place-based work is critical. People live in places, services are delivered in place, system is experienced in place, and people in places, organisations in places are the best placed organisations to actually drive systems change because they can see the experience of community on the ground. And of course, here I lean into and call out the exceptional expertise of our First Nations people in helping us rethink the fact that all members of community are vital and need to be supported around health.
Thank you, Alison. And Phil.
Yeah, and I just wanted to pick up because you had so many good points there, and Alison's point that the practice wisdom in this room and across sectors is immense. And what we are not good at is capturing that practice wisdom and turning it into best practice, showcasing it, sharing it, scaling it. Like that so often, and I've got a life lived in community service provision. I see it all the time, amazing practice that's not translated. So I think we've got to get, as a sector and sectors, more sophisticated about documenting our good practice and sharing it. And I think that deep listening to community is something that, is one of the structural issues we have. We're all, most people in this room will be professionals and we'll all, have gone to uni, and if you're in the Victorian family violence sector and recommendation 209, you've all done a social work degree. We've got to understand our power and privilege in the system as practitioners, and we need to question that and reflect on that our position and put that aside and listen deeply to community and to embrace community-led responses, because, as I said before, doing the same old that we've done and relying on established systems, structures, processes will not get us a different result. So, I think that deep listening and the translating our wisdom and our knowledge as a sector into practice is really important.
Thank you, Phil. And Judge Harland, did you have anything to add to that?
Look, I guess from a sort of slightly different perspective, I would say it's really important that every single one of us realise that we can make small changes every day in the conversations that we have with our family and our friends and other people when they start talking about coercive control, and when they talk about it in a way that's uninformed or sort of myth-based, and sort of challenging that, and not condemning people, because that's not going to bring anybody on the journey, but challenging that thinking, I think is something that everybody can do and needs to do. And I think the other thing is listening to children, as I said before, believing children, but also building on our capacities to understand what kids are telling us, because we don't do that very well. We expect kids to adapt to adult spaces all the time, and we actually need to make the space safe for kids to express themselves. And they might have complex views and complex feelings, because it is complex. Just because they're young doesn't mean that they don't have all of those feelings and thoughts. It might be that they express it differently, and we need to tune into how we can listen to that. And I think the other thing I'd say that's probably not related, but violence is a choice. It is not a mental illness. It is not something beyond someone's control. A person might have mental illness and be engaging in violence, but violence is a choice, and it's a parenting choice, and it's a bad one. It's not an illness.
Thank you very much. Very important points there.
Hi, I've been a social worker for 25 years. Done lots of pretty hairy work, in St Kilda with street-based sex workers, and I spent a decade working with kids in out-of-home care doing trauma recovery. I work in Ballarat now in adult mental health, and I must say we've had a hell of a 6 months. And I guess that for our community, it felt like it started with the Daylesford crash, which brought lots of media and, police to town. And then obviously we had bushfires. And then we've had 3 deaths of women this year, 2 to family violence, and 1, I guess, remains to be seen. And working in adult mental health, we've been manning booths out in communities and handing out our phone number to communities impacted by the bushfires. And I must say, there's pretty good models for how you do that kind of disaster recovery, right? But I found myself, talking to parents from the primary school where Hannah Maguire was a teacher, or sitting in the community of Clunes where she grew up, just like running a drop-in and feeling a bit like I'm not really sure what the model is here, apart from, obviously commiserating with people. And obviously we've had lots of police kind of roll into town because of all of the murders, and then we've had lots of media in town as well, which I think the community fund's really dramatising. And it's not that other kind of disaster recovery. I think there are lots of well-established models. I think we do bushfires and floods and stuff like that quite well in Australia. And I've done all of the T's, I've done all of the training over the years, but like I said, I found myself at a bit of a loss talking to the parents because she was a grade 2 teacher, Hannah Maguire. or, you know, Samantha Murphy's kind of community, which was, you know, her kids were really involved in the art scene. And I'm not sure, and look, it may not be an answer for you guys, but I'm not sure what that model looks like other than a grief and loss one, except that, like, it's different though. And this isn't about, like, what happens to the immediate family. This is actually, like, about, you know, the dude who worked at the newsagent, or, you know, like, there are, I don't know, 300 or 400 kids at that primary school. And I wonder if there is a good way of working in community after those things happen that is established, because we've been doing lots and lots of looking this year, and I can't say we've found anything that looks, you know, particularly conclusive. So I just wonder about the practice wisdom in the room. Thanks.
Thank you. So that's very profound. The points you're raising are very, very significant for that community and for other communities where those things happen. Who of our panellists has some wisdom to offer?
Perhaps the only thing I would say is, you know, I go back to attachment relationships, and I think what you're calling out is that power of place. And our attachment relationships don't stop at our families, do they? They continue. And when we think about the Building Strong Communities model, there's all this call out of how important those relationships are. I love getting a smile and a engagement with my barista. He's my favourite person of the whole day. It makes me feel good. And that's our lives. Yeah, we engage with these people every day. You create this safe network around us. And conversely, when you have these awful experiences, it's that broader system, that broader community that carries that. So I'm just so sorry that you're dealing with that. And I think there is some work that we can do, and we can once again lean into the attachment repair work. And I'm happy to chat offline. I'm part of a group of CEOs who are thinking about community trauma and how do you actually do community trauma recovery. And there is some stuff we can learn from disaster recovery, because when you think about disaster recovery, it's actually about attachment and connection, and people rolling up their sleeves and talking and connecting, and there's some really good stuff. So I just wanted to extend my empathy to you all and what you guys are dealing with. It's incredible, and happy to keep talking afterwards.
Yeah, and I'd just say work is critical there, and you know, to be looking to partner with, you know, local place-based organisations like Community Health and similar.
Yeah, I think that genuine response to actually meeting the need in the moment is absolutely key. I mean, because that's what we do. We meet needs in the moment, and as those moments continue, what we know is that getting the right response in that moment and staying alongside people is really critical. I do think, you know, we've got a lot to learn from emergency responses. Did you notice last week, 2 weeks ago, we had a national emergency in domestic violence, friends? Last night we found out it wasn't that big a deal in the budget. And I think that's the kind of letdown that communities can feel. So I think it's very important for us to be thinking about how do we avoid the mistakes of disaster recovery emergency where people roll into town, do their thing and then roll right out again. But how do we think about what is the in-the-moment trauma-informed response that stays around, because people's response and people's recovery takes time. So we need to continue to be there. The other piece is that we have about 700 victim survivors who engage with us, and many of them tell me that their recovery is very embedded in their ability to take action, to make change. And I think those opportunities are important. I'm not suggesting it's the same, but also just, you know, our solidarity with you. It has been an absolutely devastating time.
Thank you. Now, I'm just conscious that we have a question at the back first, and then one over here, and then one over here. So I'm just conscious of the order in which people have put their hands up.
Thank you, and thanks to the panel. I'm Wendy Sturgis, CEO of Child and Family Services in the Central Highlands. So, along with the other person who spoke, we've been feeling the collective pain and trauma of what's been happening in our community. Also been trying to manage the court-mandated men's behaviour change program and the decisions that are being made there. And it's been a really tough space. My call out today is to some of the things that are being discussed, particularly when we consider with children that are removed through the statutory system into out-of-home care. Almost 90% of them come from violent homes. So we've got an opportunity there to break down those silos and give those kids some specific support. I mean, not a once-a-month counselling session, which leads me on, and particularly kids in youth residential care who can't live in foster, who can't live in kinship. We've got to connect up that work because particularly in Ballarat, a geographical hotspot of childhood sexual abuse, it's actually a really big problem for us to work with trauma far more effectively. So I call that out, and I also hope that we can actually keep alert to the willingness, the over-willingness in just trivialising these complex issues and wanting to move to models that only have transient attention on some of these very deep and complex and intergenerational problems. So I keep that, I shout that out because I feel that could be the next wave. Let's have another short-term program that will fix it. Might make us feel good, I'm certain it would, but I don't think it's going to address the complexity. So I hope that we keep alert and don't let that roll into town. Because I don't think that will actually help us in the long term. We know from men's behaviour change it takes time, it takes investment, it takes a community, and it takes a specialist workforce.
Thank you very much. And there was a question over this part of the room.
Thank you. I'm Kay Hardyfeld from International Social Service Australia, and I manage the International Parental Child Abduction Support Service. Bit of a mouthful. I'm just thinking about our sector, and I'm looking around this room and it's dominated by females, and I'm thinking about this issue as a gender-based issue, and I guess in social work, most social workers are females as well, and I sort of think about this army of women here and in our sector who are trying to address this issue, but I'm wondering, where is the army of men, and how do we bring men on this journey and engage men on this issue? Big question, sorry.
Thank you. So, our panellists. Phil, I think you're ready to go.
I've got the beard. Look, I think that's absolutely our question as well. As No to Violence, we're an organisation that focuses on men and, as I said, shifting the burden. Because it is women who have carried the burden, the emotional work, the emotional labour, the physical harm, the economic cost everywhere you look. And where are men, and why are men not engaging? And I think that is, that's a huge question that we need to be asking and researching and understanding. I have a sense that I have a whole discourse about male privilege, and part of male privilege is not feeling like you have to fight a battle. I think a lot of men don't see themselves as belonging to a class called men. And I think that's at the heart of male privilege. I think women, white middle class feminist women, see themselves as belonging to a class called women. I think that might fray a bit when you start talking about culturally and racially marginalised women and bunches of intersectionality. But I think the sense of identity rests with people who are marginalised or oppressed. White middle class middle-aged men, of which I am one, with no discernible disability, part of that privilege is we don't need to identify as belonging to a class. So when there's a call to say, where are men on this issue, we don't hear that call because we don't identify as being men. You know, we don't belong to that class. I think that's part of it. I think the other part is men who don't use violence don't see themselves as being part of the problem, so why do they need to be part of the conversation? It's not me. I'm not that man. This is not an issue for me. I don't see it. Again, part of white male privilege, not seeing things that are going on around you or feeling like you have a sense of identity or belonging or responsibility towards it. And I think for men who use violence, it's not their fault. You know, that's in their mind. You know, I was talking to one of our staff who was working in the prison in Hobart yesterday, and she was working with 75 men who were there on remand for the use of family violence. Now, these are blokes who, their violence has been reported, they've gone through police, they've gone to a magistrate, they've been picked up and handcuffed and taken to prison. They're sitting in a cell 23 hours a day looking at four walls and a poster saying ring the Men's Referral Service, and it's still not their fault. They still don't take responsibility. It's, she made me do this, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for her. You know, men's ability to not take responsibility for their own behaviour is sometimes absolutely gobsmacking. So, so your question, and the other part is those men who do use violence, who are looking for a way out, those men who ring our referral service and say, I've just found myself throwing my daughter down the hallway. I can't believe I did that. I grew up in a family where that happened. I was that kid who got thrown down the hallway. They want a way out, and they don't know that pathway out, and they don't see themselves, they don't have the capacity to engage in that problem either. So when you start segmenting all men and you start breaking down why are men not engaging in this issue, I think there's all of those issues and probably 100 more I haven't even thought of. But what I do think is our public health messaging is not landing with the people it needs to land with, and I think we need to have a really, again, a far more sophisticated conversation about saying, how do we engage men in this debate, because this starts with men and it must end with men, and they're the ones who are absent from the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you, Phil. I can see that Judge Harland wanted to say something, and then we'll go to our last question.
Look, I want to say I think that we don't have more men working in this system because we as a society don't value this work. We don't place value in terms of salary, in terms of status. You know, instead it's looked at, say, in the legal context, that family law is a soft area, that social work, you know, that's a messy, emotional area. And so we as society are still associating all those things where it's messy and it's emotional, which is scary for people. We don't value it. We value the things that make money, that are more, concrete and male-driven. And until we start to actually value the sectors, and part of that value is actually paying people what it's worth, and paying people, like not having people on casual short-term contracts and not having casual short-term funding for services, which I had no idea about until I joined this board, and find horrific. I don't know how you deal with that additional stress of not knowing if you're going to have enough money to keep staff and to keep doing the work you do. And I think that's, the fundamental thing is that we don't value the work.
Thanks, Judge. We'll have one last quick question, because I'm sure you're all keen for morning tea.
I just wanted to make a statement because there's been some stuff up there around justice reform and bail reform. Justice and bail reform is not the whole answer, and we need a whole suite. We need prevention, we need early intervention, we need everything. But I think that there are women in high-risk situations who need a good and responsive court to high-risk situations. And when we criticise that, oh, that's this or that's, we don't need that and that's the same old. Well, actually, it isn't the same old. We need reform in that area. I think Molly Ticehurst's parents would be saying we need reform in that area, and we need that system to work as well as it could because lives depend on it. Absolutely. And I just think that it's not the whole answer, and I absolutely accept it, but it is part of the answer, and it is needed for women and children in high-risk situations, and I just wanted to make that statement.
And I'll just jump in there and say, No to Violence fully supports that view, and I wouldn't want anything I said earlier to be construed as saying that wasn't important, but what worries me sometimes is we think that that's the end game, and the conversation stops at bail reform. And, we've been working very closely with the New South Wales government over the last week or so in the lead up to their changes in bail reform, and have been very supportive of those approaches. So, yeah, I wouldn't want to be saying anything that I've said to be considered as being opposed to that really important work.
I'd like to thank you all for your thought-provoking discussion today, and it is quite a challenge to reflect on how we might mitigate family violence and change the trajectory going forward. So I'd like to thank Alexandra, Ray as the chair, Karen, Phillip and Allison. Thank you very much.